Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks what atheists should be doing next in a godless world.
Hello, welcome to Beyond Atheism. Joining us today is Clare Stainthorp. She's a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow in the Department of English at Queen Mary, University of London. A writer and researcher, she's primarily working on a new project about 19th-century atheist, secular, and agnostic movements and their periodicals. Her first book came out in 2019 and was on the Victorian poet, atheist philosopher, and scientist Constance Naden. She has also co-edited a volume of primary sources titled Disbelief and New Beliefs for Routledge Historical Resource on 19th century religion, literature, and culture, which came out at the end of 2020. Clare, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Clare, can you give us a background? How did you get interested in the history of atheism and free thought?
Yeah, so it's something that, I sort of grew up in a sort of secular household. I was never sort of brought up in a religious context.
Wow.
But I'd always been in a family where, if we went on holiday, we'd go look at the churches or we'd look at, the graveyards. You sort of have a sense of religion as culture, religion, and how it sort of fits into society. So I think I've always been interested in thinking about religion, but from a slight outsider's perspective. And then when I was at university, the University of Glasgow, I became interested in the person that I ended up writing my first book on, Constance Naden, who is a Victorian poet. And she was sort of identified as an atheist, a free thinker. And I think that was the kind of thing that set me off around thinking about what it would have meant to be an atheist in the 19th century. I find quite often when I talk to people, or just sort of if they say what I work on and I just say atheism in the 19th century, people will assume that that just wasn't a thing, or that their immediate response at least is, oh, like, was there any at all? Is it sort of seeing Britain especially as a very religious society in the sort of 19th century? So I've just sort of continued to return to it, I suppose. I just find it intensely fascinating, and so I guess I've just always kept on looking into different facets, and then had this great opportunity to pitch this new sort of 3-year project in which I'm researching the actual movements themselves. So rather than just the ideas that were circulating, thinking about the people who identified as freethinkers.
Maybe we can just, I should say thanks, Claire, for joining us. Maybe just sort of as a broad kind of introduction, maybe just talk about the meaning of free thought in the 19th century. Like, what is a free thinker, I guess?
Yeah, I really love it as a term, because to me it does have this capacity to it that you can be. So generally, it's a term that's a bit of a catch-all for atheists, agnostics, secularists, humanists, although that wasn't really a phrase that was used quite so much in the 19th century, but people who were really questioning the way that religion structures society, and that religion being a real sort of basis to how people are expected to live, in specifically Victorian Britain is what I'm looking at, but the term free thought circulates much more internationally than that. So to me, it's indicative of the fact that you're not just, say, if you say an atheist, that's a very clear stance about religion, but it doesn't necessarily say anything more broadly political or social or cultural. Whereas I think there's something about the term free thinker, and free thought, which indicates that you're also questioning, why are the hierarchies in society as they are? Why are people who are, why does the class system exist, and how does that lead to inequalities? Why are the gender systems as they are, and why does that mean that women don't get to vote when men do, for example? All of those things are bound up in this broader cultural sense of free thought, I think, in a way that the more narrow definitions of atheism, for example, don't actually necessarily have all of those broader resonances.
Yeah, and this is one of the questions we keep we keep returning to on the podcast is like, what does it mean to be an atheist? Because it is, you're right, we tend to think of it in this very narrow framework, and we're trying to figure out what it is beyond that. And I think like the free thought, we've talked to people on it about free thought in America in the 19th century and early 20th century, but this sounds like it had a bigger presence in the UK at the time. What and you, as you said before, that when you tell people about your project, they kind of can't even imagine it existed in the 19th century. So, what was the historical context that people like Constance Naden are coming up in and beginning their writing in their work?
Yes, so the way I see it at least is that there are kind of two quite clear strands of atheist thinking or free thinking in the 19th century. You have what would be considered quite an intellectual tradition, so the one that comes from, say, the Romantic philosophers and poets at the very end of the 18th and start of the 19th century, which was seen as more acceptable to a certain extent. People like Shelley, for example, who, because they're writing about these things in quite rarefied, intellectualized ways, they're actually being accepted by sort of higher classes or by sort of the educated classes, but not seen as necessarily dangerous. Although that's glossing over some stuff, but it's nonetheless true to a certain extent. And then you have this second tradition of free thought and atheism in the 19th century, which comes from people like Richard Carlile, from Robert Owen, and then leading into people like Charles Bradlaugh, who are generally working class, are coming from a sort of more socialist tradition. There's a lot of links with Chartism, for example, and the workers' rights movements of the first half of the 19th century. And this is where, when these sorts of groups, when these working class radicals are starting to publish these periodicals, the kind of ones that I'm looking at, in which they're really agitating for change to the working man and woman, that is seen as dangerous, and that is seen as so that when there start to be trials for blasphemy and people are put in prison because of their stating these atheist beliefs, that's generally that's the working classes, and it's seen as a danger because it's the masses.
Yeah, I think you're right about just how free thought is bound up with, yeah, not, it sort of transcends just religion, but it's also about things like class and politics and so on.
Hmm.
First, maybe we'll talk about your book about Constance Naden, and then we'll
Mm.
move into your current project. So she was a free thinker, but also a poet, and that sounds pretty interesting. And maybe you can just tell us a bit about her life, and then we can kind of get into more detail about her.
Yeah, so actually, in some ways, I don't think she negates what I was just saying about the two strands of free thought, but she does bridge them in a certain way. So she was born in Birmingham in the UK in 1858 to quite a wealthy family, but a wealthy industrialist family. So not kind of, an aristocratic background, but certainly they had money. And she was brought up by her grandparents because her mother had died in childbirth and her father remarried, and she was given really a lot of liberty to pursue her interests and her beliefs without being hemmed in by, I think, what so many 19th century women were hemmed in by, a need to either make a living or marry in order to be, making a way in the world. So she was brought up in by going to Unitarian schools, so a sort of nonconformist background, and then she sort of came to more sort of free thinking ideas through reading, say, German idealist philosophy and thinking about the sciences and materialism as being a better way of explaining the world, the universe, and everything than any kind of religious teaching that might try and say that it's explaining the world, universe, and everything. So she studies at what became the University of Birmingham, but at the time was called the Mason College of Science. She studied there for about 6 years, studying a really wide range of subjects. So rather than taking a single degree in any specialism, she's sort of spent a year doing chemistry, then geology, then biology, then physics, and was, by all accounts, extremely clever, was sort of doing very well in these classes. But her reason for doing that was because she was developing this atheist philosophy of her own that she called hylo-idealism, which was making the case that, sort of, as I said, if you can understand the world through this sort of new scientific knowledge, then we don't need any kind of dualist religious belief. There is no place for spirit. And in terms of how her poetry fits into all of this, she publishes 2 volumes of poetry, one when she's one in 1881 and one in 1887, so the start and the end of her 20s, really. She dies at the age of 31, so she has quite a truncated life. And then in these poems, you can see that she is working through a lot of her ideas. So, what I talk about in my book is that there is something about poetry that's a sort of flexible space in which you can think through new ideas, you can put on different voices, you can try out different characters, you can work through metaphors and see where they take you in a way that when you're writing a philosophy essay, for example, or a sort of scientific essay, it doesn't have that same kind of flexible parameter to play with your thinking. So the way that I would certainly argue she was drawing together the poetry, the science, and philosophy is that she was sort of using poetry as a place to think through her ideas, which as they became more concrete, she was then able to be publishing in pamphlets or in letters to periodicals or sort of in her sort of own longer essays. Yeah, so she's a really fascinating and multifaceted figure, and she's someone who was really committed to the idea of interdisciplinarity, that we can't understand the world just through one lens, that we need multiple lenses. The arts and the sciences need to come together to really appreciate the world. And so that's kind of another sort of facet of her sort of philosophical writings, is this idea of needing the arts and the sciences to come together.
I mean, that's such a remarkable path to take. And it sounds like she's forging it on her own, especially like pulling together these different strands and expressing herself through poetry, which I don't think is a common path for philosophers or scientists. How unusual, even in like her education, is her circumstance at this time? And how did you first come across her?
Yeah, so she is unusual. She's certainly not the only person. Some people have written some really great things about the poetry that scientists write, and it's certainly she wasn't unique, but she was unusual, and her sort of friends and her circles saw her as sort of unusual, that she was this really impressive woman who seemed to have this intellectual stature in terms of the breadth of her work and her reading that was really quite astounding. She did have circles in which she was working, and that so she had support from the professors at Mason College, from the development of the social sciences in the period that she was living in the 1870s, 80s. So people like Herbert Spencer, for example, who was really developing the whole concept of the social sciences, really was something that she was tapping into. So there were these kinds of circles. And then she was also publishing in the Freethought periodicals, so not under her own name. We think probably because she felt that her class meant that it would have been quite disreputable to be putting her own name to these sort of quite radical working class periodicals. But still, she is sort of moving between different circles. But in terms of how I originally came to her, she is best known, although relatively unknown, but best known as someone who wrote a series of comic poems called the Evolutional Erotics, which are not erotic poems. They're really humorous sort of narrative poems about applying Darwinian sexual selection to human relationships. So taking a comic eye to the kinds of relationships that I think she was probably seeing at Mason College between precocious women and sort of precocious young men who were sort of studying the sciences and thinking about ideas that probably their parents wouldn't have been thinking about. So, for example, there's one in which the spurned male suitor talks about how he's been passed over for the more dandified males, which at least shows that
Right.
Darwin is true. So,
Yeah.
All right.
uh,
Mm.
and so I first came across her in that context because those poems get anthologized a little bit, and I sort of the wonders of how much is digitized now. All of her poetry is on archive.org, which is a fantastic resource for looking at 19th century texts, and sort of realizing that she didn't just write these 4 funny poems. She actually wrote a much larger corpus, a much more varied corpus. And so, yeah, being really interested and just drawn in really by what else she was writing and how she came to these ideas.
Were there many women in colleges and universities at the time?
Yeah, there were increasingly. So I think the main difference is that so you have the kind of Oxford and Cambridge colleges, which very much sort of kept out women for a long time, and then both Oxford and Cambridge did get women's colleges, which sort of allowed women in, but very separately. They weren't allowed to have degrees. So, for example, Somerville College. So that started to allow women into the universities. But really, where women started to be able to access higher education was in the sort of metropolitan colleges in other places. So, for like Mason College in Birmingham, or colleges in Manchester and in other towns and cities in the UK. And in general, these new colleges that were being set up in the last couple of decades of the 19th century were begun on the basis of being co ed, and that women and men were able to study on completely equal terms. And so women were in the minority, but they were there on equal terms, which was the important thing. And you generally tend to see that a lot of the women are there and then they move into teaching. And you can see that that's quite often what they're doing with their learning. And I think one of the things that Naden is quite unusual is that she just is there really clearly for the love of learning. And because she doesn't have these financial pressures, she sort of inherits money from her grandparents when they die. She is able to just really commit herself to that rather than feel like she needs to then find the job and work out what's next.
What was the reception of her in the free thought movement, and then more broadly, like the reception of like a woman in the free thought movement?
So we know quite a lot about how she was received in some ways because she dies in 1889, as I say, at the age of 31. She gets, there's a lot of obituaries. There's a memoir that's written by her friends after she dies, because obviously it's quite shocking that this sort of impressive young woman has been lost so soon. But I suppose on the other hand, you have to then take all of the very laudatory things with a slight pinch of salt, because they're remembering someone who has died tragically, rather than it being a sort of completely objective remembrance, I suppose. But certainly, she was seen as a real asset to the free thought movement, because she was pitching herself to a certain extent as a philosopher. An atheist philosopher. She was also engaging with sort of circles such as the Aristotelian Society in London, which was a kind of different. It was a more was that again that more sort of intellectual strand of atheist. But in both sort of sectors, there was a real sense of loss in terms of her early death. In terms of women more broadly in the movement, they were very much there and very present, but they were always in a minority. So we have some of the biggest names in the 19th century free thought movement, for example, Annie Besant, who was the partner of Charles Bradlaugh for a while, who was really one of the most outspoken and well-known freethinkers during the sort of 1870s and 1880s. And she was really respected, and there was no sense that she, within the movement, within the freethought movement, there was no sense that she shouldn't be speaking because she was a woman, for example. Again, because if we think about free thought as being this broader sense of challenging received ideas, there's a sense of challenging, well, why shouldn't women be allowed to speak? Why shouldn't women be on the platform and be debating a man? And also Annie Besant was involved in distributing contraception pamphlets, and there's an element of sort of free love and sort of sexual health things going on within the free thought movement as well, and she's sort of placed within that. But in the broader sense, Annie Besant left her husband and loses custody of her children as a result of her involvement in the free thought movement. So from that sort of sort of the broader sense of British society, it's certainly not seen as okay for a woman to be part of these movements, because she's seen as a bad influence upon her children to the extent that she's no longer allowed access to them.
There were these incredible consequences for being so outspoken and, I guess, radical.
Mm-hmm.
Were free thinkers, were they known extensively? Were they popular? Or was it a very, very niche intellectual thing? From the sound of it, if you're being pilloried like that, it seems like you're making inroads into the mainstream. Was Constance Naden also well known publicly?
Naden, I think, was well known in her Birmingham circles, so in a kind of quite a local context. I don't think she was well known, particularly in a wider national context, although she moved to London in the sort of year or so before she died. And at that point, she was starting to be involved in the early suffrage movement. People like Millicent Garrett Anderson, who was a really important figure at that time, was one of her friends, and Naden spoke about suffrage. So certainly she was building a more prominent place in sort of people's awareness. In terms of the Freethought movement more broadly, in terms of numbers, in terms of if you're looking at how many people were, say, a member of a sort of secular society or something like that, they are pretty limited. They're pretty small. There's a sense that there is a lot of people who just don't particularly subscribe to any religion at all, but they're not part of a sort of militant movement. They're not radicals. They just aren't necessarily engaging with organized religion. In 1851, when they did a religious census, they found about 50% of the people in England and Wales were not going to church on that particular Sunday. They chose to count people. So there is a sense that there is a sort of general secularism going on. But in terms of the broader sense of how freethinkers were perceived in the 19th century society, they were seen as radicals, and they were seen as, I guess, a problem by what you'd look at as the mainstream press. So someone like Charles Bradlaugh, who I think has come up in sort of previous podcasts and things that you've done, but he was elected as MP for Northampton, and that was right at the start of the 1880s. And he actually wasn't allowed to take his seat in Parliament for 6 or 7 years, and that was because of pushbacks against him being able to take an oath on the Bible, which he didn't believe in, and it was sort of became quite a complicated situation. But fundamentally, that was something that really pushed the idea of atheism or free thought up the public agenda, made it very visible, because this was an ongoing and quite sort of active debate going back and forth at the level of Parliament. But I think the general sense was, even though clearly people in Northampton didn't mind a free thinker because they clearly voted him as their MP,
Right. Yeah.
nonetheless, he was being kept out by the powers that be.
Yeah. So I want to make a transition to the work you're doing now on the periodicals, but
Mm.
just to give a few last words about Naden, because she did have a very, very short life, and I wondered if you could talk about like what happened there and what the response was from people whose attention she did have, like Herbert Spencer.
Yeah,
Uh,
so it is a sad end. So she gets, what it almost definitely seems to be is that she has infected ovarian cysts, which become very large and swollen, and usually in the sort of end of the 19th century, you would avoid surgery, and especially abdominal surgery, at all costs, because it's a very messy place to operate, and so you simply try not to. But in the end, it got bad enough that she was operated upon, and she did survive the operation, but she died of infection a couple of days, maybe a week or so later, just the day before Christmas Eve on 1889. So yeah, it's a really it is this sense of her being, yes, taken far too soon. And she gave her last paper at a sociological society meeting in sort of October of that year, and so she was still clearly very engaged with her work and sort of in the midst of things. There was an unfinished business there, which was something that obviously so many of her friends and colleagues really picked up on as being part of the tragedy. And yeah, so as I sort of said, she was engaged with the work of Herbert Spencer, who was writing this synthetic philosophy, this sort of multi-volume work that really resonated with Naden and her sense of this sort of unifying philosophy that she was building, and she certainly drew upon his ideas. We know she wrote at least one sort of letter on his behalf to a newspaper to debate someone who had been questioning Herbert Spencer's ideas. So they did have some sort of correspondence or relationship, although no actual correspondence between the two survived. So it's hard to really work out exactly what the contours of that were. But what does survive, because her friends print it in a memoir after she dies, is that Spencer sends a letter to one of her closest friends, Robert Lewins, to say how, firstly, how sad he is that Naden has died, that she is the most sort of intelligent woman he's met after George Eliot, with whom he was very close. So really being very positive about her. But he can't help but finish this letter by saying how the fact of her death clearly shows that the female body is unable to sustain the kind of masculine intellect that Naden displayed.
Right.
And I think especially the fact that it was her ovaries that were clearly were the problem. I think this sense that the female system had somehow become corrupted by her, as I say, this sense of it being a masculine intellect because it was scientific, because it was philosophical. So it's a real shame. But then her friends really come out to bat for her and sort of really sort of make a clear statement about how this is just absolute nonsense.
Yeah, just insane. And it's one of those things that we've come across again and again, that
Mm.
this idea like that science is neutral, or that science has all the answers, when clearly it doesn't. There are biases built into it, and it's a shame that when people who, the lights that shine the brightest can just be snuffed out like that.
There's a lot of similarities, I think, like between another podcast we did with Kimberly Hamlin, who,
Mm.
who wrote a biography of Helen Hamilton Gardner, who was a 19th century free thinker in the U.S. I
Mm.
mean, just in terms of like Gardner was, I mean, like throughout her life, she was interested in science and wanted to show the equality of men and women, and sort of took on male scientists who said, that women's brains were inferior and things like this. I mean, anyway, people should also check out that podcast as well.
It's a great.
Uh,
I gave that one a listen. Yeah, I
okay.
really enjoyed it. I need to read the book.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, like some of the similarities between them. Why don't we turn to your current project? Right now, you're involved in a project looking at atheists and free thought periodicals in the 19th century. I think like today it seems atheists and other secular people sort of keep in touch over the internet. But in the 19th century, it was periodicals and newspapers that were sort of filling that role. Maybe you can just talk about your current project and what you hope to learn from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is, as I say, quite a pretty new project. I officially started it in January, and obviously, given the current lockdown conditions in the UK, that libraries have only opened in the last month or so. So it's been a slow start, but it's a project I've been thinking about and sort of developing for a good couple of years. And actually, exactly what you're saying there, Nathan, about the ways in which atheists stay connected, and potentially the kind of parallels with the place that the internet holds in the present day is something that certainly comes into what I'm looking at. The idea of free thought communities and free thought networks, and how these were developed and sustained by the sort of periodicals that were being published in the second half of the 19th century. So I should probably say, when I say periodicals, I think maybe that's quite a vague term for someone who doesn't work on them. So what we're talking about are generally papers that are coming out every, some of them are weekly, some of them every 2 weeks. They generally cost 1 or 2 pennies, so they are accessible to the working class readers, given that that was the kind of circles that they were, for the most part, trying to penetrate in terms of readerships and audiences. And the contents of them is incredibly varied. So you have certainly dispatches in terms of what's currently happening in terms of atheists and free thinkers in sort of Britain and more internationally as well. So talks and debates and things that might have been happening. But then there's also a lot of more, I guess you'd call them sort of either philosophical or reflective writing about the history of sort of atheist thought, thinking about sort of sociology and anthropology of religion, thinking through the problems about in the Bible in general in Britain when they're talking about being against religion. They are talking about being sort of against the Christian church, because that's the context in which they're writing. And so there's a lot of work, that's a lot of writing in these papers that are trying to pull apart the Christian sort of assumptions about why the Bible is wrong. Effectively, is a lot of what's in there, but there are also much broader. There are book reviews, and there are also, and it's also used as a place of contact for the people who are reading as well. So there's a lot of space in these periodicals for readers to engage with what is happening in the papers. So you have these correspondence columns in which readers are writing to the editor, and it's sort of being published, and they're sustaining these conversations about sort of atheist thinking throughout. So for me, what's really interesting about these papers, and they've been used so far by a lot of historians as a way of piecing together what was happening in free thought in the 19th century. So they're a primary source to think about, well, how can we trace particular figures, particular discourses, particular stories. But what I'm quite interested in, I'm from a literature background, working on poetry previously. I'm quite interested in, but what were they what were they writing? How were they writing it? Like, what was the form of what they were doing? And so there is a lot of poetry, and there are short stories in there. I'm really interested in, quite often there's the form of a dialogue, which has quite a sort of classical lineage in terms of, it will be a fictional dialogue between a free thinker and a priest, for example, and it's sort of playing out the kinds of arguments you might have been thinking you would want to have with a member of the clergy. Or you sometimes have these verbatim reports of the debates that are happening in real life between, say, someone like Charles Bradlaugh and sort of a clergyman, which were quite often happening around the country, around Britain. There were very regular talks and debates around these subjects, and these debates find their own way into the periodicals too. So it was a way for people who might have identified as free thinkers or atheists, agnostics, secularists, to find a common ground, this common ground with other people, where they might have found themselves quite isolated in their own communities because they're making a choice to move away from the kind of community that's likely structured by the church very often.
Yeah. So they sound like they had a very, very mixed readership. Is that correct? And what kind of circulation did they have?
Yeah, it's quite tricky to know who the readership are in some ways, because because unless you're sort of finding sort of diaries and things like that, it's hard to really put to really pinpoint. But in terms of the correspondence that we get, and also you can see, for example, sometimes they will have fundraising campaigns and they will put lists of the people that have donated, and it is a really wide range of people, generally working class, artisans, people that have a sort of trade. But yeah, it's varied. And in terms of the circulation, it's not huge. It's also very variable, but it was sort of anywhere from sort of 1,000 to maybe sort of 10,000 at their peak. But what we do know is that, because even though these are made as cheap as possible, as I say, a lot of them are only a penny, they nonetheless circulate far beyond a single person. So quite often they'll be sort of passed around groups. There are sort of social occasions for secularists to meet up, and we know they're being shared. I quite recently came across a letter in which someone was responding to a previous article and actually puts a sort of addendum at the bottom of their own letter saying, "I'm sorry if I've misquoted anything. I've recently sold on my issue, so I can't check back exactly what the wording was." So that's a really interesting little snippet of, okay, so it really was actively circulating. It wasn't just being passed on, but actually sold on as second hand. So these are the kind of things I'm quite interested in following. But sometimes it's just that serendipitous. You notice something and go, okay, well, that's a new piece of evidence.
Right. They sound a lot like zines, where they're just like they're produced very, very locally for a very select group of people, and then have this legacy as they're handed on and passed around. Were these very local publications?
So as I say, so they are incredibly varied. So I've kind of got a spreadsheet that's sort of ongoing, but is kind of trying to piece together different ones that were running between the middle of the 19th century and the start of the 20th. And I've kind of got 22, and some of them last for a year or two, some of them are still going today. So what is now the New Humanist started its life as Charles Watts's Literary Guide, which began in 1889, and also the Freethinker as well continues right through to today and is still published as an online publication now. So the longer lasting ones have a much more national and international scope to them. Some of them are smaller as well. I want to tell you about one of my favorite ones, which is most like a zine. So yeah, the fact you said a zine is very apt, by a guy called Dan Chatterton, and he names his paper Chatterton's Commune, the Atheistic Communistic Scorcher. And and it is Republican. It's incredibly radically atheist. It is polemic. It is so angry. It runs for about a decade between 1884 and 1895, and that is a personal. It's a passion project. It's a guy, Dan Chatterton. He's a bill poster, so very much working class, and he's just writing these screeds about as much about republicanism as atheism, but certainly very atheist, and talking about, well, where do we go when we die? How do we imagine these rotting souls in heaven who are like lousy and piled on top of each other? Where's the space? It's this sort of really visceral sense
Mm.
of the what he sees as the absurdities in religion. So yeah, they really do vary from really quite formal and national publications to things that are much more local and
Yeah.
much more focused.
And for our American listeners, Republican here means anti-monarchical.
Yes, right,
Yes,
right.
sorry,
Yes.
yes, absolutely.
No worries.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
Yeah.
bit of a
Yeah.
difference.
it is. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you can say a bit more about the political aspects of the movement. Like, what were the sort of the political goals?
Yeah, yeah. So there is a general, it is very varied. And I think, kind of going back to what I was originally saying about freethinker being a very sort of all encompassing phrase, it is a broad church, if I want to use that phrase,
Yes.
in terms of where people were coming from politically. So you did have people who, so for example, George Jacob Holyoake, who was a really, really one of the most important figures in the kind of city in the mid 19th century and going into the later part of it. And he was the one that coined the term secularism. And he had quite a moderate liberal view, like in that he wanted church and religion to have no place in the running of the state, but that people are allowed to continue being religious if they so wish. He sees it as just, it's about really separating out and making sure that we live in a secular society, and seeing that as a liberal project which is going to improve the conditions of the worker, it's going to improve the conditions of women, and it's just the idea being that it's kind of got inflections of socialism, that we're going to just improve the state of the world by doing this, because it's the church and it's religion that's really ossifying society and making society be as unfair as it is. Whereas you have someone like Charles Bradlaugh, who is the one that is elected as MP, and he has a more radical take, that he is very much anti-religion, and he is trying to convince people that they are wrong if they believe in any kind of religious basis, and that we need to really rethink. Sorry, we need to, I suppose, ascend to the next step up in society is an atheist society, in which we have rid ourselves of the foolishness of religion. And so he is more radical, and in terms of sort of politically radical as well. And he's certainly supporting suffrage in terms of votes. And I'm trying to think of other specific policies, and I'm immediately losing them. I know, Nathan, you've got obviously a background in the 19th century Freethought movement as well. But yeah, if you have any other of ones of his policies, they're currently.
I mean, one thing to say could be about like empire. He was, for example, sort of a friend of India, and wanted to give greater rights, I suppose, to Indians, and just like advocating for colonized people in general.
Yes, yeah.
That's, yeah, the one example, I guess. Yeah.
So, Claire, before wrapping up,
Mm.
is this work with the periodicals? Do you see this as a thread, an unbroken thread that continues to this day? I know some of the periodicals exist, but in terms of the conversation that's happening, or is there a radical break somewhere before it sort of restarts with what we're seeing in more contemporary times?
the period that I'm looking at is certainly, well, it's been called the golden age of sort of free thought in Britain. So this sort of second half of the 19th century is where it becomes most diverse and rich, I suppose, in terms of the sort of range of people that are engaging in it. And I think into the 20th century, you lose a sense, I think, of a very clear free thought movement on the public stage, although the secular societies, they continue to exist. And so the National Secular Society in the UK still exists. Humanist UK comes out of the Rationalist Association, which is another 19th century association. So there are these threads, but I think it's that the way in which I think it stops being a kind of radical working class movement and becomes something else. And I'm not sure the best way of describing it, but it just doesn't have quite the same heft to it, I suppose. But there is this definite lineage, and actually there's been some great work that's there's just a new website actually that Humanists UK have developed called Humanist Heritage, which really specifically looks at the kind of longer history, but especially over the last 200 years or so of sort of humanism and how that is obviously part of the free thought movement in general. I guess the other way to look at it is the way that atheists see themselves and the kind of rhetoric around atheism and that kind of thing. And there, I think, quite often when I'm reading these periodicals, I think that some articles wouldn't need a lot of editing to be a
Yeah.
blog, an
Right.
angry Richard Dawkins-esque
Right.
blog. And I think that the terms of the debate haven't always changed a huge amount in a certain facet of, and what I think is actually maybe obviously the height of the Richard Dawkins-esque atheism was really, I think, a couple of decades ago now, but or at least one decade ago. But that kind of really angry, beating religious people over the head with their stupidity, effectively, that kind of rhetoric, which I think is really damaging and doesn't do anything, actually, because I don't think anyone has ever been convinced of their position being wrong because they've been told they are stupid. I think generally that's a way to make people really cement their current positions. And I think we saw that in things like people ignoring Trump voters when Trump was first elected. I think it very much fed into the Brexit debate in the UK, in that people were told you would be stupid to leave the EU and therefore not really engaging in good faith in the people that actually did in the end vote to leave the EU. And I think there's an element of that in some elements of atheist groups, in which it's this sort of logic and reason is sort of seen as the be all and end all, and there's really no engagement with the idea of faith. You can't really tell someone who has faith that logically they shouldn't. I think that it just doesn't actually make sense. And so I think in the 19th century, we absolutely do have a lot of that kind of really antagonistic atheist rhetoric, in which it's a slight echo chamber in these periodicals. They're talking to each other and they're all almost telling themselves how clever they are, that they are much cleverer than the religious people who don't see that they are right and religious people are wrong. But then you do have this shift. So the Rationalist Press Association, the Rationalist Societies, are actually set up by people because they want to push back against this really antagonistic kind of atheism. They challenge what they call the scoffing habit, that some kinds of free thought only harden foes and alienate many who would otherwise be friends. And I think is something that sticks with me, and I think to bear in mind when I'm thinking about how I want to engage with people on all parts of the spectrum of belief and disbelief, is that it doesn't really make sense to berate people and scoff at them.
Yeah.
So
I think that's right. Just one other final question before we wrap up. I was just wondering, like, what your thoughts are about like the current state of secularism in Britain. I mean, it's somewhat kind of a paradox because it's in terms of like the actual numbers of people like claiming religious belief seems like relatively smaller than the US, for example. But there's still sort of things about bishops having seats in the House of Lords
yeah.
and things like this. So maybe you can just talk about what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it is very fraught, and as you say, Nathan, it kind of has two very clear sides to it, in that, yes, officially, there is a Church of England, and that this is a sort of Christian state that has lords in the House of the bishops in the House of Lords, and especially within the education system, the number of faith-based schools is actually really high, and the way in which that then feeds into the kind of education that children are getting is, I think, quite often not engaged with as much as it should be, because it leads to a lot of inequalities in various different ways around what the kind of education that people are getting, because you don't always have a huge amount of choice about which school you go to, in terms of where is local and where is deemed, I suppose, best. But the way in which many of these, I'm doing air quotes, good schools are actually faith schools, and especially at primary schools, involve hymns and things like that. It's so embedded in society, despite the fact that, as Nathan says, there's a relatively large number of people who don't subscribe to a faith, and certainly the number of people that don't sort of attend worship. It always depends how you're going to define what you mean by someone being religious. Is it their background? Are they going to church? Is it just having some sort of faith or belief of some sort? So it's difficult to pinpoint, but I'm not sure I've really got a point that I'm making here, other than describing things in general, because I just think it's very fraught. And personally, I believe that, yes, society would be all the better if it were to sort of be, I suppose, truly secular, and that sort of religion obviously continues to exist and be practiced, but doesn't have a sort of place in the politics of our country and the sort of education in the country, and sort of the ways in which those things seem to be sort of entwined, I think, is where it's problematic. But there are a lot of good there are sort of campaigns and things like that. There are people who are being proactive in trying to challenge these things. I mentioned before Humanist UK and the National Secular Society. So that there are people who are trying to do the work, I suppose, but it's hard to see whether which way things will continue to move, given the current sort of increasingly conservative nature of the
Yeah.
country in which I live. So.
Oh, can I
Yes.
just ask one other question, just out
Oh
of
my.
curiosity? Just a quick one. I mean, just like we were talking about republicanism
Mm.
in the 19th century, and I wonder if like Charles Bradlaugh or people like that would be surprised that the monarchy is still around. And I wonder about, I don't know if you have any thoughts about like the future of the monarchy. I mean, this is just sort of a random question that occurred to me.
Yeah. It's an easy question.
It's an easy. I won't
Yeah.
ramble. I'll just really sum it up in 2 words. No, I think they probably would be. Would they be surprised? I don't know. Yeah, sorry. No, I haven't got a good sort of a position on the 19th centuryists and how they would. I think certainly they were railing, because they were very often railing against the monarchy, but I don't think that necessarily means they believed that in 100 years' time it would be gone. I think you could hold those two things at once. I do feel like that there's an increasing sense that the monarchy doesn't have a clear place in society. I imagine this wouldn't have necessarily come on your radar so much, given that obviously you're both on the other side of the Atlantic. But Prince Philip, who was the Queen's husband, died relatively recently, and the protocols for that in the UK around the media and what must happen when there is a royal death is extremely prescriptive and very much based in several decades ago, when these kinds of rules were put together. And so it meant that all of the schedules were cleared, and so there were just sort of documentaries about Prince Philip and nothing else on the sort of main channels, even though there's, say, 4 BBC channels and all the channels were showing the same thing. The radio was playing only somber music. They clearly have a very specific playlist that they had play at this point. And the BBC, so the main British broadcasting company, actually got a huge amount of pushback from viewers and complaints, and they had to set up a specific sort of complaints page on their website to be like, if you
All
want to
right,
complain about how we're doing this,
right.
here's the most straightforward way of doing that, which did seem to indicate that there is this sort of shift of obviously some people felt like this was incredibly disrespectful and that we should be yeah, we should absolutely be all collectively mourning the death of our monarch's husband. But I think there was also a very loud, I would say, majority of people who felt that it just didn't really sit with a modern society, or the society in which we see ourselves to be most of the time. So I do think that things are shifting, and I think it will be interesting. I guess inevitably the Queen is going to die relatively soon. She's nearly 100. So I think at that point, I do wonder whether there'll be some sort. There will certainly be a lot of debate, but whether there'll be some sort of maybe reckoning, in the sense of, well, this is the end of this second Elizabethan era, which has gone on for multiple decades. Where next for the monarchy? Personally, I think it isn't a necessary institution, but I'm not sure whether the powers that be will agree. So
Mhm.
maybe we'll have another referendum and that result will go the way that we're not expecting. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the biggest surprise was that Philip's funeral got such terrible ratings. It was all the morning. Like, if people aren't watching, they're going to cancel the program, basically.
yes, there is
Yeah,
certainly that side of it too. You just got to keep an eye on the ratings.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Claire, this went on for a while, and I think we could talk. I do this all day.
Mhm.
It's been so lovely to chat with you.
This
Yeah,
Yeah.
has
so I
been
know, I
this
know
has
my
been
some of my
great.
answers were long and
No,
rambling,
no,
but I
it's
hope
fine.
they were
No,
just interesting.
that's perfect. Is there anything you want to plug?
Oh
Anything else
yeah.
you want to add?
Yes.
Um, no, not specifically. But in terms of my sort of ongoing project, if people want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at Clare, which is CLAREGS87. And so, yeah, if people want to see what I end up doing next with this project, please do follow me, and I'm sure I'll be tweeting about it.
Mhm.
Awesome,
Great.
excellent.
Sounds good.
Thanks for coming on.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Todd, what did you think of the preceding discussion?
You know, every week we talk to someone interesting who finds something amazing, and then I just want to talk to them for hours and hours and hours. The first thing I notice is the world is way more interesting than I had expected. There's always something amazing out there. What is your immediate takeaway?
One of the interesting things for me was when she was talking about Constance Naden and her sort of linking science, writing, and poetry. I mean, like more sort of scientific theorizing and so on with poetry. I mean, I think that's sort of important. Maybe sometimes people in the atheist community might take science as and reason as sort of like the be all end all. And but I think it's like you can also gain knowledge from poetry and from literature and stuff like that. But it's, I mean, obviously it's like a different sort of knowledge, but yeah, but anyway, I think that was quite interesting.
And to reach people that way, it's
Yeah,
amazing
that's
that you
true.
can be known for these many different facets. One thing that happened for me is Claire really improved my understanding of free thought and what it was in the past, and I think how it extends to our moment now, because this is something where, I mean, she put it very explicitly, right? Like, it ties a lot together. It's people who question everything. It's not, it's sort of rooted in questioning religion and the sort of religious foundations, but it spreads to everything. And I really love that she was able to find like how intersectional it is, right? Which is something that we've seen already, but kind of walked around, like with like Helen Hamilton Gardner, right? Like, it feeds directly into her feminism, and
Yes,
here, like,
yes.
how it feeds into so many different things, especially like class issues. It's gender, it's class, it's race. So in your own studies, it's about how it intersects with race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think I'm starting to get a feel of how our view of atheism, that small a atheism, this rejection of religious authorities, this rejection of what we're told to believe without any evidence, the sort of things we're made to take on faith, how this rejection can start to build a positive philosophy.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
one
Mhm.
of the ways it does it has been traditionally in the past to transition to a major difference. What Claire was talking about is this really organic intellectual exercise where even people who are like, the way she was talking about Constance Naden's education. even though it's a formal education, she takes it in this very, very unexpected way, right? Where it's multidisciplinary. She's pulling in poetry. She's looking for these bigger connections. This is an organic intellectual exercise. And in Claire's other study, she's looking at how all of these basically zines, how all these publications are reaching out to all different people and creating this broad swath of intellectual activity from feminists, from scholars, and from the working class. And that's amazing, right? That people are going out and discovering it on their own. And the major difference now is, whereas that's something you and I had to do, right? We had to discover there is no God. We had to question it. We had to walk this path alone. We had to get to a place where we were comfortable admitting to ourselves and to others we live in a world without God. A lot of people are not going to have to do that.
You mean they're just raised without religion and they never
Yeah,
have to. Right,
right. The
right.
way Claire was raised secular, the
Yes, right.
people who are people like us who've become secular, the people who follow us will be raised in a secular house, not a religious house. That's going to create a much stronger chain than between if we try to follow these pieces from the free thought period publications in the late 19th century up until now. I get the sense that we will find out it's just people rediscovering atheism every generation, right? Right up to people like Richard Dawkins. But since that time, it's an unbroken chain. It's going to build on the legacy, the understanding that we already have. I think that's going to be really, really important for what it means to be an atheist. We're going to have to deal with that in the future.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's an interesting point because in the 19th century, like a lot of these periodicals like had fairly intense like readings of the Bible, and I mean like really examining the text very closely and like even looking at like the original languages it was written in and things like this. I mean, it's interesting because like these were often like working class people without any
Yeah.
formal education, but they're reading in the papers like debates about really complex issues about like free will and like determinism and so on. But I wonder like, as we move to a more secular world, obviously, I mean, we might still have the philosophical debates about free will and so on, but definitely we lose like biblical literacy and like interest in that. And I mean, I guess I don't know, like I don't know if that's a loss or what. I mean, but it's a change anyway. So
Yeah, it's a change. 'Cause if you consider all the other stuff that we've lost,
yeah,
it's not really a loss. Like, we still have culture that's tied to
yeah, that's true.
like Greek mythology.
Yeah,
We're definitely not as literate about it. But even if you look at medieval or Renaissance paintings that have symbolic depictions that are like religious, ooh, like he's holding an orange and she's petting the dog. Like, we
yes,
don't right?
right.
We
And
can't
those are all callbacks to something like
yeah.
in the
Yeah.
Bible or whatever. Yeah,
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 like we can't decode that. It doesn't mean we
yeah.
can't appreciate the art, doesn't mean we can't
Right. That's
learn it.
true.
And again, the thing is, like, we want to free ourselves from forms of religious domination, not from a cultural understanding or an appreciation of it. I mean, like, I don't know about you, but anytime I travel anywhere, I end up visiting a cathedral or
Uh huh.
church or
Yeah.
temple.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
how can you not? It's the architecture, it's historical, it's amazing, it's powerful. I don't want them to be burned down or destroyed.
Yeah. Right.
I just don't want them to be sites of domination and
Mm-hmm.
lying
Yes. Right.
and shaming, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
That's
true.
that's where we diverge with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm. Which reminds me, there's a point that I feel we should make as atheists. Hurting people in houses of worship is wrong. Even if you're an
Yes.
atheist and you disagree with what they believe, what they say, how they're perceived to act, whether you're a lone gunman who's just going to go, starting a live stream on the internet and intends to kill as many people as possible, or you are agents of the state who are trained military agents and you just want to attack people while they're praying in a house of worship, that's morally abhorrent. And it's abhorrent for anyone to do it to anyone else in that situation.
Yes. Yes. I
So
agree.
let's not lose sight of that.
No. No. Definitely not.
Well, I'm glad that to hear that you agree with that.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. In other news, how's your Twitter going? Has it been blowing up with requests from people about Beyond Atheism?
Not as much as I would hope, but but we'll get there though.
How do
I'm
people
sure of it.
reach you on that?
You can follow me at Nath G Alexander.
I can't be followed anywhere. That's pretty much
Right.
it. Before we get to telling people to subscribe, if you're looking for something to do, if you want to be active, you want to get in touch with people, see things happening, decisionday.org was set up by the Secular Coalition of America. They're going to have a virtual rally and discussion the day that the Fulton versus Philadelphia decision ruling is announced. That's the Supreme Court case where religious groups are suing over the ability to use public money to discriminate. So that is, if they receive money um, to run an adoption agency, the state or city pays them to find families to adopt children, they are able to use that money to impose their religious ideas on the outcome, meaning they can discriminate against homosexuals, they can discriminate against people with different religion, they can discriminate against atheists if they so choose, using government money. We don't know what the ruling is. It hasn't been announced yet. It could happen pretty much any time. If you want to get in and RSVP for the virtual rally and town hall, that's happening at decisionday.org. And then you just got to watch the news to make sure you know when it's going to happen. Anything else in the business end of things?
Just like and subscribe, and like I think you can also rate and review it in some places. So that's another thing to do. And also there's a possibility to support the podcast on anchor.fm/beyond dash atheism. If you wanted to support the podcast financially, you can do so, and we'd be very thankful if you did.
We'll read your name. We have
Yeah,
no
sure.
limits. Yeah.
Whatever. Yeah. We'll read your yes. It's that would be quite a prestigious honor.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So,
So
yeah.
get on that. We're
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So
Right.
send us your money. Like and
Right.
subscribe. Ring the
Yes.
bell. Pull the string. Whatever it is.
Hmm.
Big thanks to Red Japan.
Yes.
Great tune. Sounds better every time. And I guess that's it.